Across their adult lives, Americans who have lent money to a friend or a family member have handed over an average of $5,022 and gotten back an average of $2,857. That is 57 cents on the dollar, and that is the average, not the horror story. A separate study of family lending found that only 56% of those loans were ever repaid in full, that the most common borrower is a sibling, and that nearly a quarter of the people who lent say the loan damaged the relationship, including 3% who say it ended it outright. Hold on to 57 cents because that is the priced end of a chain, and the first link in that chain costs nothing and looks like nothing. The first link is somebody knowing your number, not asking, not borrowing, knowing. If you are sitting on $2 million or more and you think the risk is a relative with an outstretched hand, you are looking at the last station on a line that started years earlier at a dinner table in one sentence, said warmly, by you. And by the time the sequence reaches the part with a dollar figure attached, every earlier step has already happened, and none of them can be walked back. So let me show you where that line actually starts. Because the $2 million threshold is not a thumbnail number. It is a real statistical border, and it is worth knowing exactly where you are standing on it. According to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, the entry point to the top 10% of American households by net worth sits at roughly $1.94 million. The median American household, the one exactly in the middle, the household most of your neighbors actually are, has a total net worth of about $193,000. Everything, house equity, cars, retirement accounts, the checking account, all of it. So when your portfolio crosses $2 million, your investable assets alone are worth roughly 10 times the entire balance sheet of the median household in the country. And it gets more specific than that. Charles Schwab's Modern Wealth Survey in 2025 asked more than 2,000 American adults what net worth makes a person wealthy. The answer came back at $2.3 million. The same survey found that Americans define merely comfortable at $839,000. Sit with the gap between those two numbers for a second, because that gap is the whole video. Comfortable is $839,000. Wealthy starts around $2.3 million. Your $2 million portfolio does not land in the middle of that range. It lands in the zone where the moment somebody hears the figure, the word they apply to you silently changes categories, and that is the actual mechanism. It is not your balance that changes anyone's behavior. It is the label. Nobody in your family is running a discounted cash flow model on your portfolio. They're doing something far simpler and far more consequential. They're moving you from one mental folder to another. Yesterday, you were a retired person with savings. Today, you are a wealthy person. And people do not treat those two folders the same way. Not because they are grasping, but because those folders come preloaded with completely different assumptions about what is available. This is why the request, when it comes, does not arrive gradually. It arrives already sized, because it was never calibrated to your withdrawal rate. It was calibrated to a category you got moved into by one sentence. Since we are on the subject of what happens after a number leaves your mouth, I put an analysis of exactly this kind of decision into a digital book I wrote called The Exit Code, including the part where your portfolio stops being savings and starts being the only paycheck you will ever get again. The link is in the description if you want it. Back to the mechanism. Because here's the part people underestimate about disclosure, and it is the reason I am framing this as a chain rather than a mistake. You are not making a decision about one listener. You are making a decision about every listener downstream of that one. You tell one person. Your judgment about that person may be perfect, but their judgment about who else can be trusted with it is not yours, and you will never see it happen. Your brother mentions it to his wife, which is normal. She mentions it to her sister, who is worried about her own retirement, which is also normal. Nobody in that chain did anything wrong, and by the third repetition, your number has acquired a rounding error and a tone. Disclosure is not an event that happens once and ends. It is a release. There's no version where you take it back, no correction you can issue, no conversation where you say, actually, please forget the figure I mentioned. That does not make the figure more memorable. Deserves an answer you decided in advance rather than one you improvise in the moment. I am going to give you the exact sentence later on because it is one of the two most useful minutes in this video and it needs the evidence underneath it first. By the way, clicking subscribe genuinely helps this channel, so thank you to everyone doing that. Now let me deal with the objection you are already forming, because it is the strongest one available, and I would rather argue against myself than pretend it does not exist. You are thinking, nobody has to know my number for money to leave my account. I am already helping my kids. I chose that. It is not a leak, it is a decision. You are right, and the data is emphatically on your side. The Society of Actuaries, in its retirement risk survey work on family support, found that roughly a third of pre-retirees provide financial support to adult children, and nearly 1 in 5 are supporting parents or in-laws. Among pre-retirees supporting a sibling, 40% said it moderately or significantly affected their ability to save for their own retirement. So the pipe is already running. Nobody had to be told anything for that to be true, which raises the honest question this video has to answer. If the money is already flowing, what does telling people actually add on top? Give me a few minutes on the size of that existing flow first, because it is larger than almost anyone estimates. Savings.com's 2025 study found that half of American parents with a child over 18 provide regular financial support, and the average monthly contribution hit a 3-year high of $1,474 a month. That is nearly $18,000 a year, indefinitely, with no end date written anywhere. Then the study asked the question that actually matters for your portfolio window. Working parents who support grown children are putting more than twice as much money each month into their adult kids as they are putting into their own retirement accounts. Read that one again in terms of your own account. Not twice as much as their vacation budget, twice as much as their own future. And the categories are not emergencies. 83% are covering groceries, 65% are covering cell phones, 46% are paying for their adult children's vacations. Bankrate's survey on the same behavior found that 61% of parents with adult children have made a financial sacrifice to help them, and 37% of those parents specifically sacrificed their own retirement savings to do it. 43% gave up emergency savings. 41% stopped paying down debt. So no, this is not a video about your relatives being unusual. Every figure I have given you describes ordinary, loving, completely normal American family behavior at every income level, which means the mechanism is not moral, it is structural. And it also means the honest answer to what does disclosure add cannot be it starts the flow, because the flow started years ago. Here's what disclosure actually adds: precision. Undisclosed, you are a parent or a sibling with unknown capacity. Every request that comes your way is shaped by guesswork, which means it is shaped conservatively and it is shaped small. Somebody asks for help with 2 months of rent, because 2 months of rent is what feels askable from a person whose limits nobody can see. And when you say no, or when you say a smaller number, that answer is unfalsifiable. There is nothing to argue with. You said what you could do, and what you could do is private information. Disclosed, the entire architecture of the conversation changes. The request no longer arrives sized to what feels reasonable. It arrives sized to your balance. And the conversation is no longer about whether you can. Everyone in the room already knows you can. It is now about whether you will, which is a conversation about your character rather than your capacity. And that is a conversation you cannot win because there is no arithmetic in it. That is the moment the 57 cents becomes yours. Because once a size request lands, what happens next is not a mystery. It has been measured. Only 56% of family loans are repaid in full. 26% of lenders end up setting up a formal payment plan to try to get their own money back, which is the single saddest sentence in this entire body of research. Because it describes a parent sending an invoice to their own child. 24% report the relationship was damaged. 3% report the relationship ended. And notice what that damage costs relative to the principal. If you lend $50,000 against a $2 million portfolio, the money is survivable. 2.5% of the balance is a rounding error against a 30-year plan. The relationship is not survivable. And the relationship is what you actually retired for. So the obvious move is to say no, firmly, once, and be done with it. I want to believe that works. The data says it ends this instance and nothing else. LendingTree found that 65% of people who borrowed from a friend or family member felt guilty about asking, which sounds like a deterrent, right? Guilt should be self-limiting, except the same survey found that 67% said they would not hesitate to ask again. Guilt and repetition, living comfortably in the same person at the same time. That is not villainy. That is the completely ordinary human capacity to feel bad about something and do it again anyway, which is a capacity every one of us has, and which you have personally exercised about food or spending or a phone screen within the last week. Which means a refusal is not a door closing. It is a door that was knocked on and will be knocked on again by someone who feels awful about it both times. That is the exhausting part, not the confrontation, the recurrence. So if refusing does not end the sequence, and the sequence only starts when someone knows, the interesting question becomes, what do the people who already live at this number actually do? They stay quiet, overwhelmingly, and on the record, S. Trust surveyed high net worth Americans with $3 million or more in investable assets and asked parents how much of their financial situation they had disclosed to their own children. 52% had not fully disclosed. 15% had disclosed nothing at all about the family wealth, which leaves roughly a third who had been fully open with their kids about what they had. Now, I want to be precise about that split because it is more interesting than a rule. 2/3 of wealthy parents keep the full number back from their own children. And that is the documented default of the group you just joined. Not a personality defect, not paranoia, not some cold refusal to trust the people you raised. It is what people at this level actually do, and they were not comparing notes. But a third of them do tell. So the defensible position that the evidence supports is not silence as a commandment. It is discretion as the default and disclosure as a decision. Quiet is what happens when you have not deliberately chosen otherwise. And the reasons those parents gave for holding back are worth hearing because they are not what you would guess. The largest group, 31%, said they had never thought to have the conversation at all. After that, 24% feared their children would become less motivated. 20% feared poor decisions. 20% feared the money would be squandered. And 13% feared their children would be taken advantage of by other people. Which quietly moves the question. That is a different question with a much better answer. And the rest of this is about answering it the words, the behaviors, and the one situation where telling is the correct move. Before that, there is a cost I have not touched yet, and it is the largest one in the video. It has nothing to do with anyone asking you for $1. A number does most of its work when it is never acted on. Think about what actually happens inside someone's head after they learn what you have. They do not call you, they do not ask, they do not do anything you would ever notice. They go home, and over the following months, without any single dramatic moment, they make slightly different decisions than they would have made otherwise. About how much to save, about how much risk to carry, about what their own retirement needs to look like. You will never see it. There is no request to decline, no conversation to have, no signal at all. And it is expensive, not for you, for them. Key Wealth ran an inheritance poll this year, fielded between April and May of 2026, screening for households with $100,000 or more in income and $100,000 or more in investable assets. 2,300 people who confirmed they expect an inheritance completed it. 64% said the anticipated inheritance is actively reshaping their financial decisions right now. 40% are saving less for retirement because of it. 36% are taking on more investment risk. 18% are spending more freely on lifestyle and travel. And then the figure that should stop you. 36% of them, more than 1 in 3, have already saved or invested at least $100,000 less than they otherwise would have because of money they expect to receive. $100,000 gone out of your child's portfolio over decades of compounding without a single dollar ever leaving yours. Now, the part that turns this from sad to correctable, only about 1/3 of those people form their expectation through an actual family conversation involving specific amounts, timing, or conditions. The rest built it out of assumption, out of a comment at a wedding, out of the house you live in, which inverts the entire premise this video started with. The most expensive form of disclosure is not the full number. It is the approximate one. The vague, generous, well-intentioned gesture that gives someone enough to plan around and not enough to plan with. You handed them a variable, they treat it as a constant, and it cost them 6 figures of their own saving. Not because it is a lie, it may be entirely true, but because it is a financial instrument the moment it leaves your mouth, and it is one you have no control over after that. There is a second claimant category I have not mentioned, and I want to handle it without theatrics, because the fear-mongering version of this topic is exhausting, and I am not doing it. A known store of money raises your value as a target. That is not a moral claim. It is an arithmetic one. The effort required to reach you is fixed, and the payoff is not. The Federal Trade Commission's data shows about $16 billion in reported fraud losses in 2025, the highest on record and roughly 25% above the prior year. People aged 50 and older reported 4.3 billion of that against 2.3 billion among younger adults. Median reported losses climb with age and are highest among people 80 and over. The increase was driven largely by reports of losses over $100,000, and the number of older adults losing $100,000 or more has tripled since 2020. That is your future self, at the age where the number is most visible and the defenses are thinnest. Not a burglary story, a phone call, an email, a friendly voice with a plausible reason. Now, let me argue against my own side for a moment, because there is one fear in this territory that is genuinely overblown. And if I let it stand, I would be selling you something. The estate battle. The scene where the will comes out and the family goes to war. Depending on the estimate, somewhere between 0.5% and 3% of American wills are ever contested, and under 10% of those contests succeed. It happens. It is not the exposure. And while I am deflating things, let me take out one more. You have heard that 70% of lottery winners go broke. That statistic is usually attributed to the National Endowment for Financial Education, and the organization has publicly stated it never produced it. It appears to have originated as an offhand comment at a think tank back in 2001 and then survived on repetition alone. Researchers who tracked roughly 180 actual Powerball winners found financial ruin in about 2% of cases. I read the boring documents, so you do not have to. And sometimes the boring document says the scary number was never real. The courtroom is not where this costs you. The dinner table is. Which brings me to the beat where mainstream financial advice has actively made this worse. For 15 years, the standard guidance has been transparency, talk openly about money with your family, normalize the conversation, do not make wealth taboo. And the intention is fine, but the version that actually gets practiced is not disclosure. It is the vague reassurance, delivered without amounts, without timing, without conditions, which is precisely the version the inheritance data prices at $100,000 of your child's own saving. The advice industry told a generation of retirees to be open and never specified that partial openness is the single most expensive setting on the dial. Knowing these numbers and having a system that survives contact with your actual family are two very different things, and the gap between them is where most plans quietly fail. That gap is why I built a digital book called The Exit Code, 8 chapters of pure research, no filler, built on 50 years of actual retirement data rather than opinion. 2 pieces of it are directly relevant to what we are talking about here. The first is the 4% trap and the dynamic withdrawal method that replaces it, which is what tells you the real difference between money that is available and money that is spoken for the exact distinction every family request is going to test. The second is the mathematical framework that turns maybe someday into a specific date, because a person with a date is far harder to talk out of their own plan than a person with a vague sense of being comfortable. You can get it for less than 1 hour with a mediocre financial advisor through the link in the description. Now, the behaviors. Start with who structurally requires the number, because that list is shorter than trust would suggest, and it is built on mechanism rather than affection. Your spouse or partner requires it because they're inside the same withdrawal plan, and their decisions are priced off the same balance. Whoever manages the money with you requires it, if anyone does, because they cannot model a portfolio they cannot see. And whoever will execute your estate requires it, eventually, and in writing, because the entire point of that document is that it works when you are not in the room to explain it. That is the list. 2 names, maybe 3, and not one of them is on it because you love them most. Your adult children sit in the next ring, and this is where the inheritance data has to drive the decision instead of your instincts. They get purpose and timing. They do not get a balance. You can tell your daughter that education is funded, that there is a plan, that she will not be responsible for your care. Those statements are true, they are useful, and none of them contain a figure she can build a spreadsheet around. Then there is everyone else. Siblings, friends, neighbors, cousins, the guy at the club, the person who asks at a wedding. That ring never receives a number. Not a rounded one, not a range, not a knowing smile that functions as a number. So what do you actually say out loud when someone asks? You say true things that contain no figure, that you retired, that it took a long time to plan and it is working, that it is all committed, which is the most useful word available to you because it happens to be exactly correct. Your portfolio is not a pile. It is a 30-year payroll obligation with your name as the only employee. We planned for a long time and it's all committed is a complete answer. It cannot be argued with because it is true. It cannot be sized because there's nothing in it to size. And it ends the topic without a single defensive word, which is the part that matters, because defensiveness is itself a disclosure. If someone pushes past that, and about 1 in 10, well, you do not escalate and you do not explain. You get lightly amused and you change the subject. Nobody pushes past a laugh twice. The same logic governs your visible life, and this is where I part company with the frugal millionaire folklore. You do not need to drive a 15-year-old sedan and pretend you are broke. The caricature of the wealthy person hiding in a modest house has not held up especially well in the newer research anyway, and living small to avoid a conversation is a terrible trade for a life you spent 30 years funding. What actually reads as a signal is not the level, it is the change. Nobody around you is tracking your absolute consumption. They are tracking the derivative. The tell is the step change purchase in the first year of retirement, the upgrade that arrives right after the number does, in the same season, visible from the street. That is described practice among people who stay quiet, rather than a measured finding, and I will label it as such. But the logic is sound. Continuity is invisible. Discontinuity is an announcement, which leaves the hardest case, the one every previous minute has been circling, and it deserves a real answer rather than a slogan. Your own adult child asks you directly for money, a real amount, for a real reason, and they need it. Look at what the evidence has taken away from you. You cannot lend it because at 57 cents on the dollar and 56% full repayment, the loan version of this transaction does not reliably exist. You would be choosing, statistically, between losing part of the money and adding a payment plan to your relationship with your own kid. And you cannot open the books to justify a smaller answer because the approximate number you would show them in that moment is the thing that cost them $100,000 of their own saving. So one instrument survives. A gift in an amount you decided before anyone asked you, given once, with the amount stated plainly and the balance never mentioned. That is what changes the emotional physics of the whole thing. When you have not pre-decided, the request is a referendum on how much you love them, argued in real time, under pressure, at Christmas. When you have pre-decided, you are not refusing anything. You are giving a specific number that already belonged to them. There is no negotiation. Because you are not saying no, you are saying an amount. And an amount is not an opinion about their worth. Decide it in January when nobody is asking. Give it in December when someone is. Which finally answers the question from the middle of this. There is a version of disclosure that is correct, and it looks nothing like the dinner table. It is a named person, a stated purpose, a specific amount rather than a total, and a time you chose. We are putting $40,000 toward the down payment this year, and that is the whole of it is disclosure. It contains a number, it is complete, and there is nothing left to extrapolate. Compare that to "We're in good shape," which contains no number and somehow tells them everything. And the full figure does belong somewhere. It belongs in the estate documents and with whoever executes them, written down, precise, and boring, which is exactly where a number does its work without doing damage. So tally the list. 2 names, maybe 3. None of them casual, none of them acquired by accident, none of them at a holiday table. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes. And the same principle is running underneath everything I have described here. The advantage was never in the clever move. It was in removing the ways the plan could be pulled off course by the market, by your own decision making, and by a room full of people who love you and are now planning around a number they should never have been handed. You end up with something that does not photograph well and does not impress anyone. No figure to defend, no request arriving pre-sized, no expectation quietly running in someone else's spreadsheet. The strongest financial position available to you is the one nobody can quote back at you. And it costs nothing to hold, which is the only free thing in the entire field. A room full of people who love you and are now planning around a number they should never have been handed. You end up with something that does not photograph well and does not impress anyone. No figure to defend, no request arriving pre-sized, no expectation quietly running in someone else's spreadsheet. The strongest financial position available to you is the one nobody can quote back at you. And it costs nothing to hold, which is the only free thing in the entire field.